You know, I've spent decades studying how systems work, or more importantly, how they fail. And right now there's something happening with Social Security that most folks aren't paying proper attention to. Not some conspiracy theory, but actual policy changes that could hit your monthly check harder than you think. Here's what caught my attention. Back in March 2025, the Social Security Administration quietly reinstated a rule that had been dormant for exactly 1 year. If they overpay you, and let me be clear, this usually happens because of their own administrative errors, not yours, they can now withhold 100% of your monthly benefit until every penny is recovered. Not 10% like it was under the previous administration. 100%. Your entire check gone. Now think about the psychology of this for a moment. The government makes a mistake in their calculations. Maybe you reported a change in income. Maybe you got married and they didn't update their systems properly, and suddenly months or even years later they discover they've been paying you too much. We're talking about overpayments that average folks don't even know exist until they get that letter. And when they do get that letter, the clock starts ticking. Under the current enforcement, if you're overpaid after March 27, 2025, they can take your entire monthly payment, everything. What's particularly troubling here is the scale. The Social Security Administration estimates they'll recover an additional $7 billion over the next decade through this policy change. That's not small potatoes. And who bears the burden? It's the same people who can least afford financial disruption. Retirees on fixed incomes who depend on that monthly check to pay rent, buy medications, keep the lights on. The irony is almost Kafkaesque. The agency tasked with providing financial security can, through its own errors, create immediate financial crisis. Now combine this with the other changes we've seen. The Social Security Fairness Act finally eliminated those pension offset provisions that penalized public servants, teachers, firefighters, police officers who'd earned both Social Security and government pensions. That's genuinely good news for about 3 million Americans. But here's the rub. The agency is understaffed, overwhelmed, and manually processing these adjustments. Some folks are still waiting for payments they're legally owed, while others might suddenly face overpayment recovery because of processing errors during this transition. This is what I call a systems-level failure disguised as policy efficiency. And it's exactly the kind of thing that demands your attention, not because it's sensational, but because it's consequential. Let me walk you through how this actually works in practice, because the devil, as they say, lives in the details. When the Social Security Administration sends you a notice about an overpayment, you typically have 90 days to respond. 90 days sounds reasonable on paper, doesn't it? But here's what that really means for someone who's 75 years old, maybe dealing with health issues, possibly not as sharp with paperwork as they once were. They get a letter in the mail saying they owe the government thousands of dollars. The letter is dense, bureaucratic, filled with references to forms and procedures. And the clock is already ticking. Now, if you don't respond within those 90 days, the agency can start withholding up to 50% of your monthly benefit. That's the current rate as of my research, though these things keep changing. Just this past year, we've seen this rate swing from 10% under the Biden administration up to a proposed 100% in March, then back down to 50% by April. Think about that volatility for a moment. The government is essentially saying we're going to take half your income, maybe more, maybe less, depending on which month you happen to get caught in this system. That's not policy, that's chaos masquerading as administration. And here's where it gets particularly interesting from a systems perspective. The Social Security Administration itself acknowledges that between fiscal years 2015 and 2022, they made nearly $72 billion in overpayments. Now, they're quick to point out that's less than 1% of total benefits paid during that period, and mathematically, they're correct. But here's what they don't emphasize. By the end of 2023, they still had $23 billion in uncollected overpayments on their books. $23 billion that people supposedly owe them, much of it from errors the agency itself created. Let me tell you about how these overpayments actually happen, because this is critical to understanding why this policy is so fundamentally flawed. Sometimes, yes, it's because a beneficiary didn't report a change in their circumstances. Maybe they went back to work part-time and didn't notify the agency quickly enough. Maybe their spouse started receiving a pension and they forgot that affects their own Social Security calculation. These things happen, and there's some reasonable argument that people have a responsibility to keep the agency informed. But here's what the official statistics don't capture adequately. A substantial portion of these overpayments occur because the Social Security Administration itself is drowning in its own complexity. The agency is understaffed. They've been under hiring freezes. Their computer systems in many cases are decades old, running on technology that would be considered obsolete in any private sector operation. When someone reports a change in income or marital status, it can take months, sometimes years, for that information to properly work its way through the system and trigger the correct benefit adjustment. And during that entire time, they keep paying you the wrong amount. Then eventually someone in the agency notices the discrepancy, and suddenly you're on the hook for every penny they overpaid, even though you did exactly what you were supposed to do by reporting the change. I've seen cases reported where people received overpayment notices for amounts going back 20 years. 20 years. One gentleman received a notice about an alleged overpayment from when he was 11 years old. Think about the absurdity of that. The government wants to collect a debt from a decision made when someone was still in middle school, and they want to collect it by withholding his current Social Security benefits as an adult. There's no statute of limitations on these recoveries. None. The agency can reach back indefinitely, and they will. Now let's talk about the Social Security Fairness Act, because this is where the two issues intersect in ways that most people haven't fully grasped yet. This legislation, which became law in January 2025, eliminated two provisions that had been reducing Social Security benefits for about 3 million Americans: the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset. These were rules that penalized people who'd worked in public service jobs that didn't pay into Social Security, then later worked in jobs that did. Teachers, firefighters, police officers, various state and local government employees. For decades, these folks saw their Social Security benefits reduced because they also had a government pension. The Social Security Fairness Act said that's not right anymore. And from a fairness perspective, I agree with that decision. These were people who'd worked their entire lives, paid into multiple systems, and were being penalized for it. But here's where implementation meets reality in a way that creates new problems. The Social Security Administration had to go back and recalculate benefits for roughly 2.8 million current beneficiaries. They also had to process hundreds of thousands of new applications from people who previously weren't eligible or had reduced benefits. And they had to do all of this manually, because their systems weren't designed for this kind of retroactive mass adjustment. To the agency's credit, they actually completed most of this work faster than expected. By July 2025, they'd sent out over 3.1 million payments totaling $17 billion. That's genuinely impressive. But here's the unintended consequence that nobody talks about enough. During this massive processing effort, with employees working overtime to recalculate all these benefits, what do you think happens to the accuracy of ongoing calculations? What happens when an agency that's already stretched thin suddenly has to redirect enormous resources to this one-time adjustment? Errors increase, processing delays increase, and those errors and delays create more overpayments down the line. Let's think through the mathematics of the recovery policy for a moment, because this is where the human cost becomes most clear. Say you're receiving $1,500 a month in Social Security benefits. That's actually slightly below the average, but it's a reasonable number for our purposes. You get a notice that you've been overpaid by $6,000 due to some administrative issue, maybe a delayed processing of a change you reported a year ago. Under the current 50% withholding rate, the agency starts taking $750 per month from your check. You're now living on $750 a month. Can you pay rent on $750 a month? Can you afford your medications? Can you heat your home in winter? The agency says you can request a lower recovery rate, and that's true. You can file Form SSA 634 to request they take less than 50%. But here's the catch. You have to demonstrate financial hardship, and you have to do it with documentation. Rent statements, utility bills, medical expenses, all of it organized and submitted properly. For someone who's already stressed about losing half their income, who may not be particularly sophisticated with paperwork, who may not even know this option exists unless they read that dense overpayment notice very carefully, this is an enormous burden. And while you're gathering all this documentation and waiting for a decision, they're still taking 50% of your check. There's also the waiver option. Form SSA 632 allows you to request that the agency forgive the overpayment entirely if it wasn't your fault, and repaying it would cause financial hardship. This sounds reasonable, and for some people it works. But the standards for proving it wasn't your fault are quite strict. The agency's interpretation of what constitutes their error versus your error can be very narrow. If you reported a change, but they processed it slowly, they might still consider that your responsibility for not following up aggressively enough. If they made a calculation error, but you didn't notice and question your benefit amount, they might argue you should have been more vigilant. And all of this assumes you even know these options exist. The overpayment notice mentions them, but in bureaucratic language that doesn't necessarily make it clear what your actual chances are of success. Many people, when they get that notice, panic. They see they owe thousands of dollars they don't have. They see the government is about to start taking half their income, and they simply freeze. They don't appeal. They don't request a waiver. They don't ask for a lower recovery rate. They just endure the hardship because they don't understand they have options, or they don't believe those options would actually help them. Now, I want to address the argument that the Social Security Administration makes in defense of this policy, because it's important to be fair to all perspectives. They say they have a fiduciary responsibility to the trust funds. They're managing money on behalf of current and future beneficiaries, and if they overpay one person, that's money that's not available for everyone else. From a pure stewardship perspective, that makes sense. If you're running a system that pays out over $1.5 trillion a year, even a 1% error rate represents billions of dollars. You can't just shrug that off. The chief actuary estimated that reverting to the higher withholding rate would recover about $7 billion over 10 years. $7 billion sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But put that in context. The Social Security trust funds pay out over $1.5 trillion every single year. $7 billion over 10 years is about $700 million per year, which is less than 0.05% of annual outlays. We're inflicting enormous hardship on individual beneficiaries to recover a rounding error in the overall program budget. That's not good stewardship. That's accounting fetishism masquerading as fiscal responsibility. Here's what really bothers me about this from a philosophical standpoint. When a private company makes a billing error, generally accepted business practice, not to mention consumer protection law, limits how aggressively they can pursue recovery. There are statutes of limitation. There are requirements to prove the debt is actually owed. There are restrictions on collection practices. But when the Social Security Administration makes an error, they can reach back indefinitely. They can withhold your entire income stream, and they place the burden entirely on you to prove why they shouldn't. The power imbalance is extraordinary. Think about this from a game theory perspective. The rational strategy for the Social Security Administration, given the current incentive structure, is to err on the side of overpayment rather than underpayment. If they underpay you, you might notice and complain, and then they have to make it right, and there might be bad publicity. But if they overpay you, well, they can always claw it back later, with interest in terms of the psychological stress and financial hardship they impose during recovery. The system is structured to make one type of error much more costly to the agency than the other, so naturally, that's the error they're more careful to avoid. But that's backward. The error that should be most carefully avoided is the one that harms the most vulnerable people in the system. I've spent my career studying how organizations make decisions, and one pattern I've observed repeatedly is this. When you create a complex bureaucracy with misaligned incentives, the people working within that bureaucracy start optimizing for the wrong things. The Social Security Administration employees who make these overpayment determinations are, I'm quite sure, decent people trying to do their jobs. But their job, as the system defines it, is to identify discrepancies and recover money. They're measured on collection rates. They're measured on how much they bring back into the trust fund. They're not measured on how many lives they avoid disrupting or how much unnecessary stress they prevent. So guess what they optimize for? There's a deeper issue here about institutional trust that I think we need to confront. Social Security is called social insurance for a reason. The deal is supposed to be you pay in during your working years, and then when you retire or become disabled, you receive benefits you can count on. The word that matters there is count on. If you can't count on that monthly check being the right amount, if you can't count on the government not suddenly deciding to take half of it away because of some processing error from 3 years ago, then it's not really insurance in any meaningful sense. It's a gamble. And who suffers most from this? It's not people who have other sources of income. If you've got a healthy 401k, a pension from a private employer, rental income from properties you own, an overpayment recovery is unpleasant but survivable. You adjust your budget, you deal with it, you move on. But if Social Security is your only income, if that monthly check is quite literally all that stands between you and destitution, then having half of it withheld isn't a financial inconvenience, it's an existential crisis. The agency keeps saying they've made improvements. Wait times are down. They're processing claims faster. They completed the Social Security Fairness Act implementation ahead of schedule. And all of that is true and commendable. But none of it addresses the fundamental structural problem, which is that the overpayment recovery system is designed without adequate consideration for the human beings on the receiving end of it. It's designed as an accounting system, not as a justice system. And when you're dealing with people's ability to survive financially, you need it to function as both. What would a better system look like? I'll tell you what I think. First, there should be a statute of limitations. If the Social Security Administration doesn't catch an overpayment within, say, 2 years, they should eat the loss. That creates the right incentive for them to process information quickly and maintain accurate records. Second, when an overpayment is primarily due to agency error, as opposed to deliberate misrepresentation by the beneficiary, there should be an automatic presumption in favor of waiving recovery. The burden should be on the agency to justify why they need to pursue collection, not on the beneficiary to justify why they can't afford to repay. Third, there should be absolute protection of a minimum subsistence amount. No matter what someone owes, the agency should never be allowed to reduce their monthly benefit below whatever amount is necessary to cover basic needs like housing, food, and medicine in their local area. You don't make people homeless to recover a bookkeeping error. None of these suggestions are radical. They're common sense protections that recognize that Social Security beneficiaries are not businesses that can be dunned for debts. They're elderly people, disabled people, survivors of deceased workers. They're the exact population that most needs predictability and protection from financial shocks. Building that protection into the system isn't being soft on fiscal responsibility. It's recognizing that the purpose of Social Security is to provide security, and you can't do that if you're constantly threatening to yank away half of someone's only income. The bottom line is this. We have a system that was designed to catch and punish fraud, and we're applying it indiscriminately to cases that are overwhelmingly not fraud. We're using a sledgehammer where we need a scalpel, and the people paying the price are exactly the people the system was created to protect in the first place. That's not just bad policy. It's a fundamental betrayal of the program's original purpose. And until we fix the underlying incentive structure and decision-making framework, no amount of increased processing speed or reduced wait times is going to solve the real problem.